for Perez this morning.
Thanks, everybody. As you know, if you've been here, we kind of have a little thing going to take a selfie real quick. So if we could do number 4s this time. We did 2 and 3, but let's get a number 4 up here. Yeah, let's try. Yeah. By the way, these are going to be on Twitter because I'm old, but I'm not that old, so they're not on Facebook. They'll just be on Twitter. Okay, here we go. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and one more thing. It's actually my kid's 6th birthday today. So his name is Ellis. Can I take like a really quick video and you say like "Happy Birthday, Ellis"? Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday, Ellis. Okay, thanks. Yeah, y'all are great. Okay, thanks for that. So rather than trying to talk in a sort of vague and broad way about the many contexts of contemporary praise and worship, I thought I might offer us a kind of a case study to look at one example of how contemporary praise and worship and some of its leaders are found very much at home in a specific context, and how the spiritual and social power of contemporary praise and worship is mobilized in that context towards sort of spiritual and political ends. The case study I want to explore is of a guy named Sean Foyt. Notwithstanding his beautiful hair, I want to talk about a series of events that he started in the summer of 2020. And in some ways, he's still continuing on in a different fashion today. And I wanted to introduce you to this guy and these events. And does anyone know about these? Have you seen? Yeah, you know him? Okay. So he made a kind of little video documentary of him being in some of these places doing these worship concerts. And I thought I would play just. Kind of get the feel for the intensity of what's happening here. So just to describe it with a little bit more detail here, in response to U.S. government restrictions imposed as part of the nationwide response to the COVID-19 pandemic, this charismatic Pentecostal worship leader began this traveling series of worship concerts across cities in the U.S. Foyt positioned these events as a kind of protest and expression of Christian religious freedom in opposition to mandated church closings that were trying to slow the spread of COVID-19. He was also motivated by a perceived double standard over government restrictions. While churches were asked to close their doors to large indoor worship gatherings, he felt that the government was giving a pass to the large gatherings of protesters who were protesting police violence against Black and brown persons in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. The motivation for his events have stirred up some confusion among those who have seen them as a negligent risk to public health at best, and a willful, quote, super spreader event at worst. His response is, at the very least, if confusing, it's intelligible, I think, and even if objectionable for us, when you understand something about the theology of praise and worship that we've been exploring in this lecture series, especially as it's built on Psalm 22:3 and the power of praise. Oh, gave you one too many there. Sorry. So through worship music, Foyt and his event attendees have sought to channel God's power through worship, through musical worship in particular, to change perspectives and change atmospheres, as we talked about yesterday, and in particular to build spiritual and social power to help overturn government mandates that he thought were prejudicial against church closures and thus altogether un-American. In many ways, Foyt has channeled that basic sentiment of the song from which I've taken my title today, "The Battle Belongs to God," and has attempted to wage a battle, as the song says, on his knees and with his hands raised high in praise. So I want to explore how Foyt is a representative of both an ever-increasing gravitational pull toward the political legacy of the American South and the increasingly intertwined reality of so-called conservative politics with contemporary praise and worship theology and culture. Foyt's story is one rooted in a particular social context, a particular political context, a particular spiritual imagination. So rather than see Foyt and his worship protests as somehow idiosyncratic and unusual, I want to suggest that they follow from the spiritual and social trends embedded in contemporary praise and worship, and vice versa. Let's address some key features here that will kind of set the stage, as it were. First, why were COVID-19 restrictions seen as politically and spiritually problematic for Foyt? Oh, did I go one? Oh, no, I'm good. Okay. Sorry, I had that video in the wrong spot. It threw me off. Okay. So why were these government restrictions politically and spiritually problematic for Foyt? For those of you who've been attending these lectures, you might be able to guess that government restrictions on congregational gatherings were received by praise and worshipers as a challenge to that fundamental religious act of encounter with God through congregational singing. With that assumption as one of the only tools in his toolbox of worship theology, he and others interpreted this as a direct challenge to Christianity. It became a conflict between government mandate and biblical mandate. As I've been suggesting in this series, for Foyt and praise and worshipers, the Bible is seen to command praise as the defining characteristic of Christian expression. To place limits on it was seen as an affront to Christian religious freedom. Now, religious freedom is an important term here that we can't entirely unpack, but for the political context of white Christian nationalists like Foyt, I want to acknowledge that these folks see the religious expression of Christians as uniquely provisioned and protected in the U.S. Constitution. White Christian nationalists see the U.S. as a fundamentally Christian nation in its origins, and consequently see Christianity as its truest and fullest identity. Government mandates against the core expression of praise and worship as sung praise is, by extension, un-American and thus a political issue. This perspective syncs up with the broader political context of Christian nationalism's historic connection to Republican politics, also in the form of resistance to mandates by centralized governments. Not just the federal, but also perceived overreach of power by governors and mayors. It's in some ways a traditionally Republican impulse that, though the growth of authoritarianism in Christian nationalism makes this somewhat of an ironic and uncomfortable kind of commitment. So Foyt billed these anti-lockdown events as a Christian response to what he called the spirit of fear that he believed had caused many churches to wrongly shut their doors during the pandemic. Foyt's website described the impetus for the movement, drawing really on the deep story of American Christianity and white Christian nationalism, saying, a bit of a long quote, but the fervor to worship God free from government edict and societal persecution drove America's earliest settlers across oceans and wild frontiers. But our freedom to worship God and obey his word has come under unprecedented attack. Powerful politicians and social media giants have engaged in unchartered abuses of religious liberty, silencing the faithful, banning our voices, and outright attacking our God-given right to declare his goodness. States across America, including right here in California, have shut down church services and even outlawed singing in church. It's time for the church to rise up with one voice and tell our government leaders and the rulers of big tech that we refuse to be silenced. Now, you can hear in this quote some classic tropes, what we might call dog whistles, regarding the theology of, for example, manifest destiny of white settlers, the myth of the founding fathers as Christians, the sense of embattlement and imagined persecution of white Christians in America, despite, of course, their outsized power and influence in culture and politics. You see, Foyt has become the featured worship leader at white Christian nationalist political gatherings like Reawaken America campaign, as well as the large and influential Conservative Political Action Committee events. As a result of his worship protest events, he's become the go-to worship leader for the subculture of white Christian nationalism. That's kind of the first piece of the puzzle here. The reason why church closures were received as political and spiritual threat to those who ascribe to praise and worship. And the second feature here, and to kind of set the stage for us, is why did Foyt bring his worship protests to outdoor urban centers in particular? Evangelicalism and Protestantism and its worship in America has had a notable relationship with urban spaces. For evangelicals, urban spaces have been centers of missional activity, and the geographic settings are significant insofar as they introduce the latent vector of race. You see, urban spaces are understood to be predominantly spaces where people of color live, particularly Black and African American persons, as well as a result of the processes of what's known as white flight, where middle and upper class white folks moved away from urban spaces beginning around the 1950s, moving into the suburbs. Thus, that sense of urban is coded with racial overtones. Let's listen to how one scholar has described it. Contemporary white evangelicals tend to regard the city as both the devil's playground and a key battleground in their struggles for cultural hegemony. And I would add that you should understand here racial hegemony. Yeah, this one always gets me. Okay, you should hear it as that race is implied here too. It's one of those words you read, but then when you say it out loud, you're like, am I saying that right? Okay, so for popular revivalists like Billy Graham and influential parachurch organizations like the Promise Keepers events, the great American city provides an ideal space for massive spectacles of public religiosity and the formation of powerful institutional networks, which are used to revitalize the spiritual climate of the entire nation. So to say, just like prior leaders under the broad umbrella of American evangelicalism, Foyt was heralding what he hoped would be a nationwide revival through, and still hopes will be a nationwide revival through itinerant worship evangelism events in ways that are hardly unique to evangelicals. And note especially how this researcher names that what's at stake here is cultural hegemony or white dominance in the broader culture. Okay, as a quick aside here, because I can't resist myself as a praise and worship historian, within the history of praise and worship, worship concerts in public urban spaces have become somewhat commonplace, at least since the time of a guy named Graham Kendrick and the Praise March movement in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Though Kendrick is from the UK, his published books on praise marches through urban centers became standard material amongst US evangelicals. Many will remember a song that takes its name from its iconic chorus by Kendrick, "Shine, Jesus, shine, fill this land with the Father's glory." So it's a classic. It's a classic. Some nodding heads from our faculty, at least. The Praise March movement took praise and worship into the streets, in this case in the form of a parade, really. These marches were an expression and an extension both of the lordship of Christ and a mechanism for spiritual warfare in the city, which we'll return to in a moment. And this happened all as the practice of praise and worship was becoming increasingly visible and mainstream among American Christians at large. And of course, public events like these also position worship leaders in increasingly prominent and visible roles as public religious figures alongside well-known pastors or other cultural commentators, something Foyt clearly has an interest in. Now, in our case, these outdoor urban spaces are the same ones that saw a groundswell of public protests in the early summer of 2020, in response to the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis former police officer Derek Chauvin. It was a flashpoint in the uproar related to that and other contemporaneous police-involved shootings of Black and African American persons across the U.S. So just as churches were being told to cease indoor public worship services because of COVID-19 concerns, outdoor gatherings for protests over racism were ramping up and were mostly not prohibited by government officials. And this was problematic for two reasons. First, protests and protesters for many evangelical political conservatives are generally viewed as morally spurious or suspicious, perhaps given their problematic and sometimes confusing confidence that governments are ordained by God, except when they aren't. To make matters worse, these protests these were protests against police officers, a class of service persons who have long been heralded in public discourse among American evangelicals as heroes of American Christian society, though tied in with a legacy of racism since the era of slavery and Reconstruction. So urban spaces in this case study I'm offering you here, to quote George Orwell's book, 1984, they're double ungood. Urban spaces, on one hand, are seen as spiritually depraved spaces to begin with, like think the devil's playground in that quote we saw, and they become sites of political resistance in ways that were seen to be an affront to the morals of American Christians who back the cross and back the badge. So with a little bit of this geographic and political framework in hand, I want to explore how worship music works or is expected to work in these worship protests, and why worship music in particular became the avenue for white Christian nationalist resistance in this case. How does worship music do spiritual and social work that reinforces and reinscribes these particular prejudices? So one other thing is true about many of the urban spaces where Foyt led his protests. They were spaces that were proximate or close to, or the places where political power was located symbolically and actually. If for Pentecostals, praise and worship is about accessing or encountering God's presence, it's also about accessing God's power. When God is present, God acts powerfully and responds to our prayers. Psalm 22:3 is read as a promise. If you praise me, I will come. And many Pentecostal preachers, teachers, and theologians over the years have highlighted this theme, the sense that God's powerful presence is magnified through one of the dominant images invoked in praise and worship, an enthroned kingly God. That is, that God has or should have political power above all. Consider, too, this historical example of representative teaching by a guy named Barry Griffin, a Pentecostal pastor and conference leader at an influential conference called the International Worship Symposium that I mentioned previously. Griffin taught that when ancient Israel restored the practice of praise and worship as modeled in David's tabernacle, the nation experienced spiritual, moral, and military blessing. The direct implication here is that if we too restore praise and worship here in the United States in the present day, we can receive those same national blessings. Of course, a place like Washington, D.C. is both an urban space and a political center of the U.S. And in the present day, when Foyt brought his events to places like the steps of the courthouse in Nashville and culminated that original series of praise protests on the Washington Mall in Washington, D.C., he was foregrounding this sense of accessing God's presence and power to change the political climate, to change the political situation. Indeed, the prominent Pentecostal preacher at Foyt's events on the Washington Mall in October of 2020, Jensen Franklin, invoked a theology of praise to rationalize the potential power of the event as a whole. Beginning his sermon by telling the crowd, "I don't know if you understand how powerful what we're doing is right now." Franklin invoked the tabernacle of David using Job 26 and the text's use of the water cycle as a metaphor in an example of really a brilliant and compelling craft of preaching on the theology of praise and worship. He says, "If you want to know what the noise of the tabernacle or praise and worship is all about, you have to understand that it's about rain. No worship, no rain. Little worship, little rain. Rain represents the Holy Spirit. Rain represents righteousness. Rain represents revival. Rain represents miracles, signs, and wonders. Rain is what we need in America and in this world." And then he says there are 9 expressions of worship in the Bible that are that invisible vapors that create clouds. So he goes on from here and he leads the crowd in short acts of kind of encompassing 9 verbal and bodily expressions of praise that he began to allude to. The object of offering God these praises for Franklin was to cause a precipitation of God's presence and blessings. Their acts of praise are like water vapors going up into the heavens until the cloud gets thick and the rain falls back down. Accessing God's power in this way is important for doing spiritual work in both individuals and communities. At the climax of his rather short sermon, Franklin powerfully exhorts the cheering crowd, saying, "America needs a washing. America needs a river. America needs rain. So send up the worship, send up the praise, send up the shouts, and give him glory." By coming to the Capitol for this worship music event, Foyt and Franklin are suggesting that worshipers are preparing for the release of God's power that focuses on the symbolic center of power at the U.S. Capitol, and it extends from there across the U.S. A very similar message is encoded in Foyt's own song, "When We Praise," which was performed at that event. The song's chorus says, "When we praise, every stronghold breaks, prison doors will shake, the gates of hell will not prevail." While the text is somewhat generic, put it up there for you. While the text is somewhat generic, we need to hear it in context. We need to hear it as an attempt to wield spiritual power over political context to serve politically conservative ends in particular. For Pentecostals, the impulse to go to the halls of power and invoke change has enjoyed renewed theological attention through a concept called the Seven Mountain Mandate that organizes society and culture including the government, into 7 areas over which Christians are intended to exercise dominion and establish God's kingdom on earth. Praise and worship has become a concrete avenue for pursuing the fulfillment of this mandate, because praise and worship is understood to be able to mobilize God's power for things like ultimately overturning laws and policies like mask mandates that prevent Christian religious expression in the form of indoor congregational singing, laws that can only be attributed to the evil forces and people at the level of state and federal government. While Foyt highlights that his worship gatherings are primarily protests against restrictions on church gatherings, his rallies have also been held in places like Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Kenosha, Wisconsin, sites of prominent Black Lives Matter protests that ultimately turned into showdowns with police. These urban centers are important to Foyt because they reveal a spiritual disturbance at work, prompting the protest, not to mention the greater saturation of media attention already focused in these places. Notably, Foyt's early description of his worship protests used the tagline, "Riots to Revival." The tagline here suggests that riots, an overt escalation of the word protests, themselves are spiritually depraved sites in need of revival. Thus, Foyt's gatherings gain this double valence concerning who the spiritual enemies are, both, on one hand, the spiritual forces behind government leaders who would place restrictions on the church, and those protesting racism and police brutality. For Foyt, praise and worship is the weapon for defeating those spiritual political enemies, just as it was, in their imagination, for ancient Israel. Turning again to the archives of praise and worship theological teaching, a perspective like this has been referred to in some places as the Jehoshaphat principle. That is, just as the king Jehoshaphat sent the tribe of Judah, the musical worshipers, to go out ahead of the army to secure spiritual victory by bringing about God's presence through praise. More than just urban contexts in general as sites for waging spiritual combat, the particular locations are significant. Powers and principalities are understood to be associated with particular geographic locations, another teaching known as spiritual mapping. C. Peter Wagner has been a loud voice in articulating this now common Pentecostal theology of place through his writings in books like Breaking Strongholds in Your City, How to Use Spiritual Mapping to Make Your Prayers More Strategic, Effective, and Targeted. One volume in a series dedicated to prayer and spiritual warfare. And this has come up in popular literature through books like Frank Peretti's novels, This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness. books that introduced the concept to many evangelical audiences who at one time would have fiercely rejected the theological notion of these Pentecostal terms. So this logic of praise as political and spiritual warfare brings to the forefront the theological importance for Foyt to go to the places where prominent protests and potentially strong demonic activity is happening. In using praise and worship as spiritual warfare, the songs of Foyt's gatherings are anthemic, and overall the tone is joyful and unrelentingly positive, even if perhaps melancholy sometimes. In the belief that the worship changes the emotional atmosphere as it changes the spiritual and hopefully the very real political situation. Because God's spiritual power is released through musical worship in general, song choice is quite important. Songs like Foyt's When We Praise, which I quoted above, are relatively forward in describing their political connections, as are other songs used at his gatherings. Martin Smith's slightly older song, Did You Feel the Mountains Tremble, and a line in its chorus, Open up the doors and let the music play, with its clear application to COVID restrictions. And another of Foyt's songs, Let Everything Praise the Lord. They both clearly identify the desired ends in their lyrics. Other sources have been co-opted into Foyt's services as well. One popular anthem that was sung at Foyt's and other recent gatherings is the song Great Are You, Lord, by a group called All Sons and Daughters. In this worship protest context, the line from the chorus of that song, it's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out your praise, we pour out your praise, becomes a clear and defiant cry against governmental restrictions on congregational singing and mask requirements, while to the keen listener, you can hear a veiled reference to George Floyd's tragic and now famous refrain, I can't breathe. Some have critiqued Foyt, saying he's just a grifter, in it for the money. And to be clear, he's been noticeably enriched in the last few years since he emerged in this political light. But I think there's much more going on. Foyt's events reveal complex theological motivations that weave together worship theology, social location, political motivations in ways that have invoked long-standing social and racial prejudices toward urban spaces and address them spiritually through worship as warfare. Foyt is just one node in a long line of Christians engaged in public political demonstrations in urban context. Though the tactics of his response to pandemic restrictions appear novel, they build on praise and worship history, on the Pentecostal theological and musical traditions going back many decades. Through Foyt and others, this latter rain musicalized political theology of worship has become entangled with white Christian nationalist discourses around religious freedom for Foyt and others in ways that are an inevitable consequence of his theological context. And yet, this worship theology is easily co-opted toward these ends that, if you haven't picked up by now, I don't think are an expression of faithful Christian witness in the world. So, where do we go from here? I want to offer just a few reflections to try to bring these pieces back together and represent them to you as questions. First, I want to name that songs are always sung in a context. They're always contextual. So how do we tell stories about the songs that we sing so to situate them in a context that might resist some of these problematic associations I've been outlining? The upside and downside of sometimes ambiguous language of worship music is that its meaning can be highly dependent on its context. So many songs, but not all, so many songs are able to take on a different meaning depending on the stories we tell and the situation in which we offer them. So how will we shape the context in which we wield the spiritual and social power of singing contemporary praise and worship songs together? And by extension, what contexts are we already in that shape the meanings that we receive from singing these songs together? Second, as American Christianity and evangelical Christianity in particular, which is the context that dominates the writing and sourcing of contemporary worship music, as it becomes increasingly concentrated in the American South, how might that context and its history and culture continue to shape the songs that emerge from the popular centers for worship music who are situated there? How might the political and social landscape of centers of worship music find their way into the lyrics and frameworks in ways that simply can't be ignored? What should we do with the fact that politically and socially conservative institutions seem to be underwriting contemporary praise and worship in more obvious ways than anyone else? And what of the posture of songs like Battle Belongs and others that position and normalize worship as warfare in ways that dovetail with broader cultural assumptions about America and warfare among Southern white Christians or white Christian nationalists like Foyt, even if it's just our melody as our weapon? As the legacy of contemporary praise and worship music Pentecostalizes the worship theology of non-Pentecostals, what do we do with these embedded sentiments about the power and use of praise that are increasingly central and mainstream and, again, simply can't be ignored? As I asked at my first lecture, I want to ask again, what do we do if we don't believe either the basic sentiment and assumption of these latter-rain Pentecostals that Scripture teaches that we can access God's presence reliably through musical praise, or that praise is a vehicle for spiritual warfare, another Pentecostal sentiment? What do we do if we don't believe these things? Is it possible and even perhaps good, then, to steward non-Pentecostal theological traditions of worship alongside contemporary praise and worship, even as we use musical styles that are inflected with contemporary pop and rock sounds like contemporary worship? And finally, I want to suggest to us that one way of resisting some of the problematic associations of worship music here is by exercising what we might call epistemic humility and spiritual humility. Though we can and should work toward what we understand to be God's imagined future and the capital G good in the world, we should be careful not to be overconfident about what and when God will bring that good to pass. We don't and can't control God's power, and we should be humble about what we think God's plans are and when God will fulfill them. And while it's true in an eschatological sense, a line like, "You win every battle, nothing can stand against the power of our God," we should be very cautious about how we attempt to wield and apply that confidence to the experiences in our lives. Are our enemies, whom we would wage spiritual warfare against, indeed God's enemies? Are we as confident in the every and always as songs like Battle Belongs seem to imply? In this lecture series, I've felt a bit like that meme of the conspiracy theory guy with the red yarn, and he's sort of like, look at this, trying to make these connections between history and theology and practice of contemporary worship music. And if anything, I hope that you've come out of this series with a sense that understanding contemporary worship, praise and worship, can't be reduced to just the lyrics or style of music, but it has a history, and that history is rooted in eschatological imagination, that it shapes our emotional bandwidth for engaging with God, and that it's enacted in deeply contextual ways. So to put it simply, I hope you come away knowing that contemporary praise and worship is often not less than, but is always more than a song. Thank you.